Okay, so we're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation just a little bit later because it is going to tie to your discussion board post. So look there for further information about that. So let's go ahead and look at how this war happened. So the early military strategies for Bunker Hill, and keeping in mind Bunker Hill is one of the bloodiest of the war, which happens around June 17th, 1775. And it takes place on the Charleston Peninsula at the north side of Boston Harbor. Now, if you remember right, what happened at Boston Harbor, you've got the Tea Party, all that kind of stuff that goes on there. And this happens only 3 days after the Second Continental Congress established an army. So the British are under Commander Thomas Gage in Boston. He received some troop reinforcements, and this troop reinforcement has some really talented generals like William Howe, Henry Clinton, and they received instructions to attack the Massachusetts rebels. It's really not very smart what they do here because you've got the rebels, they're sitting on top of a hill, and the British decide to charge this hill. Now, who has the better vantage point? Definitely your rebels, because they can just shoot everything that's coming up that hill. So they have a much better view, and it is incredibly hard when you rush a hill to take that point. So the British decide to take that bold frontal attack with 2,500 soldiers. So they cross the water and they start going up that hill. It takes 3 attempts for them to make it up the hill. And the only thing that really saves them is the fact that the Americans ran out of ammo. So they fortified that terrain in this region June 16th, 1775. And the Americans, and then they did the dumb thing. Instead of staying there and holding that hill, they retreated. So the American outcome on this is the Americans lost 140 soldiers. They had 140 that died, 271 wounded, and about 30 captured. It was a British victory, but it was very expensive. They lost to death 226 soldiers, and they had 80 wounded. But the real issue is on the outcome of this is the fact that they retreated back to Boston. And they did not fight for 9 more months. They kind of did that one, let it go. And in the meantime, we see where the colonists do start unifying a little more. Let's look at the colonists though. The rebel colonists, they had a very inexperienced militia. And the country was not unified, which we've already talked about. And as many as 3/5 either supported Britain or remained neutral. I mean, think about that. 3 out of every 5 are not willing to fight for the colonists. And Americans claimed that they were purely defensive and that they were triggered by British invasion. And I mean, you think about this. Can you really invade your own country? I mean, you can truly see both sides of this. So the militias are local defense. They're composed of all able-bodied men over the age of 16. And militias are very much suited for short-term, limited conflicts, such as what we saw with like the Indian Wars. They are not suited for an extended war. So the Continental Army really does become a necessity. So what they did was it was 1/4 of male adults. They had 230,000 enlistments. Congress set enlistment at 1 year. And the problem with this is if you only serve for a year, that's not enough to train and deploy the soldiers to where they are adequately ready to go in battle. So if a person decided to go for a 3-year enlistment, they got a $20 enlistment bonus. Now, to us, $20 doesn't sound like a whole lot. You know, figure inflation, guys. I mean, that's to them probably a significant amount of money. Enlistment for the duration of the war, you would get a land grant of 100 acres. So keep this in the back of your mind as we move forward. You get 100 acres. Where is this land at? As a matter of fact, one of my paternal grandfathers actually received a land grant while he was in North Carolina. And then what he did was he bought other people's land grants moved to Kentucky, and my family still, a lot of my family still resides on the original land grant area that he had. So this is kind of how they decided to do it. We'll give land grants if you serve the duration of the war. But there's a considerable amount of financial issues with this. So the Continental Congress printed money, but this money was not backed by gold or silver. So in other words, the money really had no real value. So if you took that $20, great, you have a $20 certificate that's not backed by anything. So that is a real problem. They also had to borrow money, and we see that they borrow money from very wealthy men. And in exchange for borrowing that money from wealthy men, they would they would give them a certificate of debt. And they would promise to pay that money with interest, kind of like a modern savings bond, or like the war bonds that we'll see, like around World War I, World War II, things like that. But the land grants that were offered actually became forms of currency. So back to my paternal great grandfather, whatever he is, way back there, he actually ended up buying 5 other land grants, and he ended up with a total of 600 acres of land. And as a matter of fact, my grandmother still lives on a portion of that property there. So that's kind of you had a much better currency with the land, but the problem goes back to, again, is where is this land coming from? So I noticed in the discussion board post that we talked about with the Indians and the misunderstandings there with the Native Americans, that most of you did grab onto that idea of land ownership being one of the biggest misunderstandings. And, and that does have some effect here as well. In response to that, there really wasn't a right answer on that. I enjoyed seeing all your answers, and many of you came up with kind of different things. But just about everything that happened between the natives and the colonists was misunderstood. I mean, I don't know that there's anything you can look at that wasn't necessarily a misunderstanding. So that land that we're seeing here that comes from serving in the Continental Army will play out as we move ahead. Women were also involved with the Revolutionary War, obviously not in this manner of serving in the war, but they did a lot of things to help. Today we actually call them camp followers. Often these camp followers, and they were not called that then, but today that's what we call them. Often they were wives of military men, and Washington actually wrote, "The number of women and children in the New York regiments of infantry obliged me to all them provisions, or by driving them from the army, risk the loss of a number of men who very well would have followed their wives." In other words, Washington's saying these wives were a real problem because the men would tend to follow their wives rather than following the army. So a lot of times Washington did feel it better to allow the women to follow them as they moved. So we see there was approximately 20,000 camp followers. And while this is an odd notion today, this is very, I mean, it's not uncommon back then. And so what happens to these women if the husbands were gone for an extended period of time? Even if those husbands were faithful, women's minds often wandered and felt that it would be better to travel in the rear. Others were seeking, and I'm not saying that all of them were afraid their husbands were going to cheat on them, but some that is in the back of their mind, so it's easier for them to follow. Others are simply seeking safety, shelter, food, and work. Men with families still needed to be able to take care of them. So for those who owned a farm, when the husband left to go be with the military, it's not as easy for the women to just pick up and continue having a livelihood at home. Robert Morris said, "I was obliged to give provisions to the extra women in these regiments, or lose by desertion, perhaps to the enemy, some of the oldest and best soldiers in the service." And these women served in a variety of capacities. Often they were cooks, they washed clothes, they nursed the wounded. A lot of times we see where children tagged along. Children were actually born as camp followers. Also, African Americans did serve in the war. There were regiments of black soldiers, and these were made up of freed black men, primarily northern African Americans. Slaves could serve in the Revolutionary War as long as they had their master's permission. And sometimes a master would say, you know, I don't want to send myself or my son to do this, so I will send my slave to fight in my place. 5,000 African Americans served during the Revolution. Some were draftees, some wanted to because of the idea of liberty. At one point, the British will say, you know, any African American slave who will fight for the British will be freed. So the colonists eventually have to do something very similar and say after a year's worth of service, you can get your freedom. And slaves in the South often allied with the British because of that resentment to the colonies, because if they're seeing that they can possibly be freed through the British, they're going to go that way because, I mean, they're not really necessarily going to be loyal to the person who owns them. There's also another player in this, which will be the French. The French provide cannons, muskets, gunpowder. They give trained military advisors. And service really does become a primary way of demonstrating political allegiance, whether it's to the British or whether it's to the colonists. Wherever you decide to serve, that is where your allegiance is. So on the colonist side, their main strategy is to repulse and defend an invading army. So they really do kind of have that home court advantage. The British have to sail from England to the colonies, and then they have to basically do a land invasion once they're here. Now the British are the mightiest power in the world, but with sailing across to the Americas, they have the problem of logistics. I mean, they have to supply food and other supplies for a 30,000 mile journey. And they have really a different outlook on this, while the United States, you know, the colonists are trying to separate and have independence. Their goal is simply to reunite. So they don't want to destroy and they don't want to conquer. So it really does create a different kind of war for the British than what we see the colonists willing to fight. And so the British are already heavily indebted because of the 7 Years' War, which is why they were putting all the taxes on the colonists to begin with. So they're already very in debt. The only big war that they had actually fought successfully in this manner that was so far away from home in the future will be World War I and World War II, and that's where we see the United States moving out and doing that. So we don't see a real successful across the sea kind of victory until World War I or World War II. So the British do have different goals. They are restricted in their minds. The colonies belong to England, and they don't necessarily want to destroy their own people. They just want to reunite. And so how do you accomplish these goals? There's no central power in the United or in the colonies to go in and pull down. So the Continental Congress, they're moving from location to location. So it's not like the British can even go in and just say, okay, here's the capital. We're going to take down the capital and go, you know, then everything's good. So their goal was to capture every major port. But the problem is 95% of the colonial population lived in rural areas. So they had 13 individual entities to restore. So they needed a very, very large land army, and England was primarily a large naval fleet. So it really is an issue, and we will pick up with that in the next video.